Chapter 5, A Floppy Fisherman and a Man on a Blanket. Jesus had a plan. He knew he could carry on spreading his awesomeness by himself, but he also knew that it would spread even further if he got a few people to help him. Great team player, that Jesus. I expect that Jesus would choose the best of the best, the super rich people, the ones that wore the coolest clothes and had the biggest houses. But he didn't. He chose a real bunch of flops. There's a picture of them all. Looks a bit like a football team. People were still following Jesus everywhere. He had genuine celebrity status and everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. One day Jesus was teaching by the Lake of Galilee and there were so many people pushing to get closer that they almost pushed him in. So Jesus climbed into a boat and told Simon, who owned the boat, that he fancied a trip out on the lake. Simon was a fisherman, but he was not a very good fisherman recently. Simon pushed off from the shore and then Jesus said, "Stop, that'll do." Simon was confused. "I thought you wanted to go out on a..." he said, but Jesus just sat himself facing the crowds and carried on speaking to them. After a while, Jesus turned round and said to Simon, "Right, let's go catch some fish." Simon was even more confused. He'd been out all night trying to catch fish and hadn't caught a single one. In fact, he was convinced that all the fish had disappeared. He normally caught a few, but this time he only managed to drag up an old rock and a few stinky old sandals. Simon looked at Jesus. There was something about his face, something different. Simon kept staring at Jesus. Jesus eventually broke the awkward silence and said, "Come on, Simon, let's go fish. Row a bit out and sling out the nets." Simon thought maybe Jesus knew that where all the fish had gone. Either that or he was playing a not very funny prank, but, well, he still had a look on his face that Simon couldn't quite figure out. A sort of serious, sort of happy, sort of trust me, it's okay face. "Okay, then," Simon said slowly. "Tell me where to drop the nets and I'll do it, boss." When Simon came to pull up the nets, he was totally flabbergasted. There were so many fish in his nets that they were starting to rip. He pulled and Jesus smiled and they both began to laugh. But Simon couldn't get the nets into the boat, and even when he called his other fishermen friends over to help, there were so many fish their boat started to sink. Even James and John, pretty good fishermen, had never seen so many fish in one place. It was amazing. Did Jesus have a special fish radar or something? When the fish just kept piling into the boat, Simon suddenly realised what had happened. He began slowly to put all the pieces together. So Jesus had done all this really cool stuff, and people were following him everywhere, and Jesus was in his boat, and Jesus had just given him the biggest catch of fish he'd ever seen, and, well, maybe Jesus was actually, Then Simon fell on his knees and mumbled, "Jesus, don't come near me. I'm a bad man. I've done bad things. I'm not good enough for you. You're just too awesome." "Simon, don't worry. You're a wonderful fisherman. In fact, you all are, except you're not going to catch fish anymore. You're going to catch people." Simon was so confused as usual, and his mates didn't really know what Jesus meant, but they were convinced it could only be something good. So they pulled in their boats, left their fish, their nets and their oars and everything else behind, and they ran after Jesus. Jesus ended up in a local town and people were following him everywhere again. And while he was walking along, a man ran up to him and knelt down at his feet. This man had a horrible skin disease. All his skin was falling off and he looked all lumpy and bumpy. Oof. Everyone always avoided people like him. They didn't want to catch their germs and they were always asking for money. But Jesus didn't avoid him. Jesus stopped and looked him in the eye. "You can fix me, Jesus. I know you can. If you want to, you have the power to make me better," he said. "Of course I want to. You're healed. That's it." The man's skin immediately looked fresh and new. He didn't even have any scars. All the lumpy, bumpy bits were gone, and he was so happy he couldn't wait to tell everyone. But just as he turned to leave, Jesus said, "Don't tell anyone what happened. Just pop along and see the priest, and then people won't have to avoid you anymore because they'll see that you're well." Don't tell anyone. That's crazy. Jesus has just done something super awesome, and he doesn't want anyone to know. Weird. Why would he do that? Why do you think that Jesus didn't want the man to tell anyone what happened? Jesus then just kept meeting people, talking to them, teaching and healing, eating with them, and just generally being, well, amazing. But Jesus always made sure he took some time out. He often disappeared off on his own just so that he could talk to God and listen to what he might have to say. Why do you think Jesus took some time out? What kind of things do you do to take time out? When could you take some time out and talk to God and listen to what might he want to say to you right today? Anyway, after a while, the news about Jesus spread to the Pharisees and their friends in the area, and when they heard what Jesus was doing and saying, they were very suspicious of him. They didn't like the fact that Jesus was stirring up the people and getting them all excited and causing chaos. They decided they'd have to see for themselves what all the fuss was about. So they chose a day, and they all went to find Jesus to check him out. Did you know that Pharisees are a group of people who were absolutely obsessed with God's laws? They made sure that everyone followed the laws to the absolute letter. In fact, they actually took things a bit too far, keeping reading to find out what Jesus said to them. Well, listening, because I'm reading it to you. They travelled for miles and miles just to see what Jesus was up to. When they arrived, they saw that the people had been saying it was true, but they also saw something they didn't expect. As usual, everyone was crowding around Jesus, shouting about their short elbows, dodgy knees, and manky skin. They knew Jesus could heal them, and they wouldn't go away. Jesus couldn't get even out of the house he was in because there were so many people pushing to get in at the door. Some people were carrying a man on a blanket because he couldn't walk. They wanted Jesus to heal him, but they couldn't get through the crowd, let alone through the door. Then one of them had an idea. "We can't go under the crowd. We can't go around the crowd. We can't go through the crowd. So let's go over the crowd." He climbed up on the roof of the house and he started pulling off the tiles until he made a huge hole. I mean, imagine if that was pulling your roof. Some random people just arrived and started pulling bits off your roof. Everyone inside stared up at him. Then a bulging blanket began to come down slowly through the hole. When the blanket finally arrived on the floor, it unfolded to reveal a man lying there. He couldn't move, and he had not been able to move for years. Lots of people looked at Jesus to see how he'd react, but he simply smiled and said, "My friend, your sins are forgiven." What a strange thing to say. Why didn't he just say, "You're healed" or something? I mean, what's a sin? Christians talk about sin all the time, maybe too much of the time actually, but what is it? Basically, sin is a fancy word for saying not loving God properly. A sin is a thought, an action, a word, or anything that we do that God wouldn't want. The trouble with sin is that it gets in the way of a good relationship with God, because God really doesn't like sin. But the great thing is that he does love us, and he wants to forgive us and start over. When the Pharisees and all the temple geeks heard Jesus say, "Your sins are forgiven," they got pretty mad. Who does he think he is? He's breaking all the rules. Only God can forgive sins, and he's just old Joe's boy from Nazareth. But Jesus stood his ground and said, Why do you think I'm breaking all these rules? What is easier, telling a man that he's forgiven or telling him he's healed? The Son of Man has a right to forgive sins." "He really does think he's God, doesn't he? How else can he forgive sins?" they muttered. "Go on then, get up, take your blanket and walk home," said Jesus. The Pharisees and the temple geeks stopped muttering and stared, along with the rest of the crowd, as the man stood up, with no trouble at all, folded his blanket and wandered off, waving his arms in the air and shouting about how amazing God is. Even though everyone knew Jesus was healing people, they also knew he was saying incredible things about himself. They knew he was pushing it with the Pharisees and the temple geeks, but they just couldn't stop being amazed every single time. Later on, when the crowds had eventually died down, Jesus went out for a walk. It didn't take long before he saw another crowd of people, except this time they weren't queuing to get a glimpse of him. They were actually queuing to pay their taxes. They hated paying taxes, but they hated the tax collectors even more. Tax collectors were always stealing, cheating, and lying their way into getting more money off people. They always took more than they were supposed to, and there was nothing anyone could do. Jesus pushed in right to the front of the queue and said to the tax collector, his name was Levi, "Come with me." And he did. Levi got up and left all of the taxes and all of his extra cash right there and just walked off with Jesus. Levi took Jesus back to his house and threw a massive party. They had loads of food, and Levi invited all his tax collector mates and friends round too. The Pharisees and the temple geeks were still hanging around, spying on Jesus. They were getting pretty grumpy too. Not only does this guy think he's God, but he's hanging around with these scumbags. "Lying, cheating, thieving scumbags," they said. Jesus heard the Pharisees grumbling outside, and he came out and he said to them, "Don't you get it? If you're well, you don't need a doctor. If you're ill, then you do. I didn't come here to hang out with all the nice people and tell them about God. I came to save sinners." Jesus went back inside and left the Pharisees to their grumbly grrr. Everyone was enjoying the party. They were eating, drinking, talking, laughing and dancing and doing more eating. A few people came up to Jesus and said, "We heard that your followers never go without food and drink. John's followers, yep, that hairy locust John guy from earlier, they do, to help them pray. So why don't yours?" Jesus told them that his followers didn't need to go without food and drink while he was still around, but one day he wouldn't be around anymore, and then his followers would sometimes stop eating and drinking to help them pray. People thought that was a bit odd, for Jesus to be talking about him not being around. He was young, fit, healthy and popular. Well, mostly. So there'd be years before he wasn't around anymore. They were about to go back to the party when Jesus spoke again. "If you've got old clothes, don't cut up new fabric to patch them. New fabric would need time to shrink before you use it, so it wouldn't work with old material. It'll just make holes even worse. If you've got old wineskins, you wouldn't put new wine in them. They'd burst and you'd waste all your wine. You'd put new wine in new wineskins, wouldn't you?" People think old wine is best, but they forget that new wine will be even better in the end. Wineskins? What is Jesus on about? 2,000 years ago, people didn't have wine bottles. They had leather pouches to store their wine. They worked well for a while, but the wine made them stretch, and eventually they'd burst. The people thought Jesus was talking in riddles, and they weren't really sure what he meant, but they wanted to know. They knew clothes and wineskins, and they really liked old wine, but maybe Jesus was onto something. Why was he so convinced that the new wine would work better? Jesus often used stories and pictures to get his point across, because he wanted people to understand what he was saying. Sometimes they didn't get it though. And even today, we have to really think about it to figure out what he meant. What do you think Jesus was talking about with his wineskins and clothes?